Pull up a chair. We are burning a different kind of fuel tonight. We have spent a lot of time recently in the blood-soaked courts of Rome and Egypt. Emperors who declared themselves gods, queens who dissolved pearls in vinegar just to prove a point. But tonight we are going somewhere arguably darker, more complicated, more modern in all the worst ways. Tonight we are going to Renaissance Italy, and we are going to talk about a woman who has spent 500 years being called a poisoner, a seductress, an incestuous murderer wrapped in expensive fabric. A woman whose reputation was built not on what she did, but on who her family was, and what they were willing to do to survive. Her name is Lucrezia Borgia, and if you know that name at all, you probably know it because of the legends, the poison rings, the dead husbands, the whispered accusations so dark they are barely printable. The myth is spectacular. The reality is something else entirely. Because here's what we're going to find when we dig into the actual evidence. A woman who was handed to the most dangerous family in the history of the Catholic Church, used as a political tool before she was old enough to make her own decisions, blamed for the crimes of the men around her, and then, against every reasonable expectation, survived it all and became something extraordinary. So tonight we are cracking open one of history's greatest character assassinations. Put this on while you're driving, lying awake, or pretending to be productive. Let's dig in. To understand Lucrezia, you first have to understand the Borgias. And to understand the Borgias, you have to understand that this was not a normal family. This was not even a normal, powerful family. This was a dynasty operating in clerical robes, using the infrastructure of the Catholic Church the way a private equity firm uses a shell company, for personal gain on an almost incomprehensible scale. The patriarch was Rodrigo Borgia, born in Valencia, Spain in 1431. By the time he enters this story, he is already a senior Vatican official, a cardinal of long standing, and a man with a very well-known secret. He had multiple children. In the 15th century church, celibacy was technically the rule. Rodrigo treated it as more of a polite suggestion he ignored with impressive consistency. He had at least 4 acknowledged children with his long-term mistress, Vannozza dei Catane. He made no real effort to hide them. In Rome, everybody knew. Nobody said anything. Because in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. And he did not become Pope through a groundswell of spiritual endorsement. He bought it. He paid rivals in land, titles, gold, and political favors to secure enough votes in the papal conclave to hand himself the keys to St. Peter's. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was explicitly forbidden by canon law. Rodrigo Borgia did it to become the most powerful man in Christendom, and apparently did not lose a single night's sleep over the irony. This wasn't a holy family. It was a cartel with a significantly better dress code. The children of the new pope were already becoming their own stories. The eldest son, Juan, also called Giovanni Borgia, was the golden boy, handsome, charming, catastrophically arrogant, and largely useless. Rodrigo doted on him. The second son, Cesare, had been pushed into a church career against his own clear preference for something far more violent. He burned with ambition. He watched Juan get favored and filed it away somewhere behind his eyes. And then there was Lucrezia. Born in 1480, she was the only daughter in the inner circle. She grew up in Rome, educated, multilingual, reportedly charming and quick-witted. By the time her father became pope, she was 12 years old. And she was already valuable. Not for what she could think or feel or build, Valuable because in Renaissance Italy, daughters of powerful men were currency. Political alliances were sealed with marriage contracts, and the Borgias had just acquired the papacy. Lucrezia Borgia's life, its shape, its chaos, its suffering, was determined before she had any say in the matter at all. The family she was born into saw to that. The first transaction happened when she was around 13 years old. Her father arranged her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. The Sforzas were one of the most powerful noble families in northern Italy, and this match was pure political architecture, an alliance designed to extend Borgia influence into the north. Lucrezia had no real voice in any of it. This was standard for the era. This was, for the record, still monstrous. The marriage took place in June 1493. There were feasts, there was celebration. Giovanni Sforza took his new bride back to Pesaro, and for a while they existed in a kind of uncomfortable stalemate. Giovanni was not cruel. He was also not particularly warm, not particularly interesting, and not particularly useful to the Borgias once the political wind began to shift. Because by 1497, Pope Alexander VI had changed his alliance calculations. The Sforza connection was no longer strategically valuable, and so, with the cold efficiency of a man who bought the papacy through bribery, Rodrigo Borgia decided to dissolve the marriage and recycle his daughter for a better match. There was just one tiny problem. Annulments in the Renaissance Catholic Church required actual grounds. The Borgia solution? The Pope publicly declared that the marriage had never been consummated. That's right. To break a political contract, God's representative on earth essentially stood on the balcony of St. Peter's and broadcasted to all of Europe that his son-in-law had spent 4 platonic years being entirely incapable in the bedroom. Giovanni Sforza was furious, humiliated, and officially branded sexually useless by papal decree. He refused to cooperate. He fought it. But eventually he was pressured into signing the paperwork anyway, because when the Pope tells you to sign a document admitting your own impotence, you sign it. But Giovanni Sforza was not the kind of man who would absorb that humiliation quietly. His counterattack was devastating. He went public with accusations that have followed Lucrezia's name for 5 centuries. He claimed the real reason the Pope wanted her back had nothing to do with political strategy. He claimed that Rodrigo Borgia wanted his daughter back because of an incestuous relationship between them. He did not stop there. He added Cesare to the accusation. He planted the seeds publicly, loudly, and with the specific intention of making Lucrezia toxic enough that the Borgias would be too embarrassed to redeploy her. Let's be completely direct about this. There is no solid evidence that any of it was true. None. The accusation came from a man who had just been publicly humiliated and stripped of his wife under false pretenses. He had an enormous personal motive to destroy her reputation. The sources who repeated the story later were, almost universally, enemies of the Borgia family writing after the fact. The whisper campaign worked spectacularly well, regardless of its basis in reality. This is where the legend of Lucrezia Borgia is born. Not in any act she committed. In a rumor spread by a bitter man who needed to wound someone and found the easiest target in the room. After the annulment scandal broke publicly, Lucrezia essentially disappeared. The Pope sent her to live at the convent of San Sisto in Rome. No court, no parties, no diplomatic functions. She was removed from public life while the scandal she had not caused continued to circulate through the city. What happened next is one of the most genuinely unresolved mysteries in her entire story. In 1498, a child appeared in the Vatican, a boy referred to in documents as the Infans Romanus, the Roman infant. He was given the name Giovanni, raised initially under Vatican protection, and eventually granted considerable titles and lands. The Pope, a man supposedly endowed with divine infallibility, issued 2 separate papal documents about this child. The first declared the boy was the illegitimate son of Cesare Borgia, born of an unnamed woman. That was the public story. Then came the second document, a secret bull that entirely contradicted the first one. This one stated the child wasn't Cesare's at all, but the Pope's own son. 2 official papal decrees, 2 completely different fathers, both signed by the exact same man. Apparently, Rodrigo treated official Vatican decrees the way most people treat a rough draft. Historians have spent centuries trying to untangle this, and the honest answer is, nobody knows. Some believe Pope Alexander genuinely fathered the child during the period and issued the first document to protect his own reputation, then later wanted the boy properly acknowledged. Others believe the deliberate contradiction was designed to obscure something else entirely, that the mother, whoever she was, needed to be protected. And a third theory, raised carefully by some scholars, is that the Infans Romanus was Lucrezia's child, born during the convent period, and that both documents were constructed specifically to erase any trace of that possibility from the official record. There is no proof of the third theory. There is also no clean explanation for why a sitting pope would issue 2 directly contradictory official documents about a child's parentage unless there was something genuinely significant being hidden. The convent, the timing, the erasure. It sits in the middle of Lucrezia's story like a locked room nobody has ever been able to open. What we know for certain is this. Lucrezia spent months in isolation during one of the most turbulent periods of her life. Something deeply strange happened involving a child in the Vatican, and then the official record was deliberately obscured by the one man powerful enough to do it. While we are here, we need to talk about the poison, because you cannot mention Lucrezia Borgia without someone bringing up the poison rings, the Borgia dinners, the legend that she was a walking chemistry set wrapped in silk. The image is everywhere. She has her own cocktail named after her. The mythology is irresistible. So let's actually look at it. The poison narrative around the Borgias is real, in the sense that the Borgias absolutely did have enemies die at convenient moments. The family operated at the highest levels of Renaissance Italian power politics, a world where assassination was a legitimate political instrument and where powerful men regularly died in circumstances that raised questions. Nobody disputes that the era was soaked in intrigue and that the Borgias benefited from some well-timed deaths. But here is the crucial distinction the legend deliberately blurs. Almost every specific poison story attached to Lucrezia personally traces back to hostile sources, to satirists, to political enemies of her father, to the kinds of writers whose careers depended on producing scandalous material for audiences who wanted to believe the worst about the Pope's illegitimate daughter. The famous cantarella, the Borgia poison allegedly carried in a hollow ring, is referenced almost entirely in sensationalist sources. Primary evidence for Lucrezia personally poisoning anyone is extraordinarily thin, the kind of evidence that collapses the second you look at it for more than 5 seconds. The more accurate read is this. Lucrezia lived at the center of a family that played extremely dangerous games. People around the Borgias died. Some of those deaths were certainly murders. The men doing the murdering, and we will get to Cesare in detail shortly, were real and documented. Lucrezia was in the room. She was of the family, and that proximity was enough for the legend to attach itself to her. Was she deadly? Or was she simply surrounded by people who were? The poison mythology is not about what Lucrezia did. It is about what people needed her to be: a powerful pope, a ruthless brother, a family operating without moral constraint. The narrative needed a female face. It got Lucrezia, and the image stuck in a way that no amount of subsequent scholarly rehabilitation has fully dislodged. In June of 1497, a body was pulled out of the Tiber River. It had been in the water for 9 days. It took the distinctive clothing still attached to the corpse to confirm who it was. The body belonged to Juan Borgia, the golden boy, the Pope's favorite son, the heir to the Borgia military and political ambitions. He had been stabbed 9 times. His hands were bound. His purse, containing 30 ducats, was still attached to his belt, which ruled out robbery as a motive immediately. Someone had wanted Juan Borgia dead badly enough to do it carefully, professionally, and with enough resources to dispose of the body. The money was left behind because this was not about money. Pope Alexander VI was reportedly shattered. Contemporary accounts describe him weeping for days, retreating from public life, and entering a period of visible grief unlike anything Rome had seen from him. He commissioned inquiries. He promised investigations. And then, quietly, the inquiries stopped. The promised investigation went nowhere. The list of suspects was long. Juan had managed to make powerful enemies throughout his short career. The Orsini family, a great Roman noble house the Borgias had clashed with, were early candidates. Various political opponents of the family had clear motive. But the name that historians have returned to most consistently is Cesare. The brother who had watched Juan receive every preferment, every military command, every expression of paternal pride, while Cesare was locked inside a church career he despised. Motive? Staggering. And the subsequent trajectory of Cesare's life, the speed with which he leveraged his brother's death to escape the church and take over the Borgia military operation, is difficult to read as coincidental. Nobody was ever charged. The case was never solved. But this is the moment the tone of the Borgia story changes permanently. Before Juan's death, the family's crimes were political and financial, the kind of corruption that Rome had metabolized across centuries of papal power. After June 1497, the internal darkness became impossible to ignore. The gossip stopped being funny. It started being fatal. Here is the detail that almost never makes it into the popular telling of this story. While her reputation was being systematically destroyed by rumor and enemy propaganda, Lucrezia Borgia was, on multiple occasions, left in charge of the Vatican. Pope Alexander VI trusted his daughter with the actual administrative machinery of the papal office when he was absent from Rome. She received diplomatic correspondence. She handled petitions. She sat in his place and made decisions. Letters from ambassadors of foreign states during these periods are addressed to her, and the responses that survive show a woman who understood the politics, the protocol, and the stakes involved. She was not forwarding the mail. She was running the office. Think about what that actually means. The most powerful religious institution in the Western world in the late 15th century was being administered by a woman. Informally, without official title, without any acknowledgement that would survive scrutiny, because the idea was fundamentally incompatible with the Church's own doctrine, but functionally, genuinely, in practice. The Pope who purchased the keys to St. Peter's with cold, hard cash, whose son was almost certainly murdering rivals across Italy, whose family name had become synonymous with corruption, that Pope trusted his daughter's judgment enough to leave her in charge. This fact sits in almost direct contradiction to the helpless pawn narrative. She was a pawn in some respects. The marriages prove that beyond argument. But she was also trusted with real power by the most powerful man in Christendom, and the evidence suggests she wielded it competently. The full picture is more complicated than either the monster myth or the passive victim story allows. In 1498, the Borgias arranged their second transaction. Lucrezia was married to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate but titled son of Alfonso II of Naples. He was young, reportedly charming, and by all historical indications, Lucrezia genuinely liked him. In a life defined by arrangements she had no say in, this one contained something that felt like actual warmth. She fell pregnant. She miscarried once, then carried a son to term, Rodrigo of Aragon, born in 1499. For a brief window, something resembling a normal life seemed possible. Letters from the period suggest Lucrezia was happy, or at least something close to it. Alfonso was kind to her. Rome felt slightly less like a trap. Then, in July of 1500, Alfonso was attacked by multiple armed men in the dark. He was stabbed repeatedly and left for dead on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, the most sacred church in Christendom, naturally. But Alfonso stubbornly refused to die. He was carried into the Vatican, where Lucrezia sat with him constantly, even cooking his food herself because she was terrified of poison. For a few weeks, it seemed like he might actually recover. But Cesare Borgia wasn't one to let a botched stabbing ruin his political calendar. On August 18, 1500, Alfonso of Aragon was simply found strangled in his hospital room. Because if hacking a man to pieces on holy ground doesn't work, you might as well just choke him out in bed and be done with it. The attack and the subsequent strangling were almost certainly ordered by Cesare Borgia. Alfonso's Neapolitan connections had become a political inconvenience as Cesare renegotiated the family's Italian alliances. He was, in Cesare's strategic calculus, disposable, and so he was disposed of. Lucrezia had done everything a person can do to protect someone from the machinery of power, and it made absolutely no difference. Cesare had the authority and the ruthlessness, and Alfonso had the misfortune of becoming unnecessary. She asked to leave Rome. The Pope allowed it. She went to Nepi and stayed there for 2 months. Contemporary letters describe her as devastated. This is as close as we get in the historical record to Lucrezia Borgia being allowed to simply grieve. Then she was called back. There was another arrangement to make. You cannot tell Lucrezia's story without spending real time on Cesare, because Cesare Borgia is the gravitational center around which her entire life orbited. He shaped it more than any marriage, more than her father's papacy, more than her own choices. Understanding him is understanding the weather she lived in. Cesare had been made a cardinal at 17, a role he resented completely. After Juan's murder removed the obstacle of fraternal competition, Cesare resigned the cardinalate, the first person in history to formally renounce the position, and threw himself into military and political life with an energy that was borderline volcanic. He became Captain General of the Papal armies. He launched a systematic campaign to bring the fractious lords of central Italy to heel. Town by town, state by state, he was building something that looked very much like a unified Italian state with himself at the head. He was extraordinarily capable. He was also extraordinarily brutal. Cesare didn't remove obstacles, he removed people. Betrayals were punished with executions. Former allies who crossed him found themselves strangled or worse. He moved fast, thought coldly, and showed a talent for ruthless efficiency that made the men around him deeply afraid, and the men studying him later deeply fascinated. Niccolò Machiavelli watched Cesare Borgia operate in person. He was so impressed and so disturbed by what he saw that Cesare became the primary model for the prince. The foundational text of modern political philosophy was essentially a case study in how one Borgia operated. That is either a tremendous testament to Cesare's effectiveness or a damning indictment of what Renaissance statecraft had become, depending on your angle. And here is the thing that matters for Lucrezia's story. She was his sister. She shared a surname with the most feared man in Italy. Every decision he made, every murder he authorized, every city he sacked, it attached to her name too. History looked at a violent brother and decided the sister must be just as guilty. The logic was never sound, but it was persistent. Lucrezia had no control over Cesare. She had no mechanism to stop him, no authority to override him, and precious little distance from him. She existed in his shadow whether she wanted to or not, and the shadow was very, very dark. In 1501, the Borgias arranged the third and final transaction. Lucrezia, 21 years old, twice married, with her reputation already legendary for all the wrong reasons, was to marry Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. Ferrara resisted. The d'Este family initially had strong objections to accepting a woman with Lucrezia's reputation. The Pope had to sweeten the deal considerably, reducing tributes, offering financial concessions, applying the kind of pressure that only a sitting Pope can generate. Eventually, the resistance crumbled. The betrothal was announced. And in January of 1502, Lucrezia Borgia entered Ferrara with a procession that reportedly stretched for miles. But before she rode out of Rome in that glittering parade, she had to pay the entry fee for her new life. When Lucrezia left for Ferrara, she was forced to leave behind her young son, Rodrigo, the only surviving piece of the husband she actually loved. She never saw the boy again. He died in Rome in 1512, just 12 years old. It is a quiet, utterly devastating detail that gets buried under all the scandalous gossip, the brutal human cost of being a Borgia pawn. She got a shiny new duchy, but it cost her her child. What happened next is the part of the story that most people who know the legend have never heard, because Ferrara is where the narrative completely flips. In Ferrara, Lucrezia became a genuinely accomplished ruler. When Alfonso was away on military campaigns, which was often, she served as regent. She administered the duchy. She managed finances, handled diplomatic correspondence, and made governmental decisions. Her surviving letters from this period are articulate, strategically sophisticated, and show a woman fully engaged with the mechanics of running a state. Not performing, running it. She became a patron of the arts at a level that made Ferrara one of the most important cultural centers in Renaissance Italy. She supported poets, painters, and musicians. Ludovico Ariosto referenced her in his work. Pietro Bembo, one of the most celebrated humanist writers of the age, engaged in a celebrated literary correspondence with her that became famous in its own right. This celebrated correspondence was actually facilitated by a man named Ercole Strozzi, a prominent poet in Lucrezia's shiny new literary circle. But because Lucrezia was seemingly cursed to have her life read like a true crime podcast, Strozzi did not meet a peaceful end. In 1508, he was found dead in the streets of Ferrara. he had been stabbed 22 times. The murder was never solved, and naturally, because she had the last name Borgia, the whispers immediately attached his gruesome death to Lucrezia. It was another suspicious corpse in her orbit, another unsolved case. Yet again, there is zero demonstrable proof she had anything to do with it, but the mythmakers didn't care. It was just another bloody footnote to feed the legend. The letters suggest a woman of genuine intellectual depth, not a decorative figurehead. She had multiple children with Alfonso. She managed a court that was, by the standards of the time, notably stable. She was not universally beloved, court politics being what they are, but she was respected. The Ferrarese remembered her warmly long after her death. The monster Rome feared became the ruler Ferrara respected. The woman handed around like a political asset created, in her third act, something that was genuinely hers. A court, a reputation built on actual achievement, a life she inhabited rather than simply survived. Within the Ferrara years, there is a thread that is very human and very easy to overlook if you are only looking for the dramatic moments. Lucrezia developed what the surviving correspondence strongly suggests was a genuine romantic connection with Francesco Gonzaga, the Marquis of Mantua. Francesco was a significant figure in northern Italian politics, a military commander, a man of influence, a regular presence in the diplomatic circles that connected Ferrara to its neighbors. He was also married to Isabella d'Este, Lucrezia's own sister-in-law, Alfonso's sister, one of the most formidable, accomplished, and fiercely competitive women in Renaissance Italy. The letters between Lucrezia and Francesco that survive are notably tender. They are not the transactional correspondence of political allies. They are warm, personal, and carry the kind of weight that purely platonic exchanges rarely do. Whether this was a fully realized affair or an emotional intimacy that stopped short of that is impossible to establish with certainty from the documents that remain. What is certain is that Isabella d'Este was fully aware of the closeness and deeply resented it. The relationship between the two women was famously cold. Isabella was brilliant, ambitious, and had spent years as the cultural queen of northern Italy before Lucrezia arrived and began building her own reputation in the same space. The tension between them was about status, influence, and artistic patronage as much as it was about Francesco. But Francesco was woven through it. It is a very human triangle inside a story usually told only in terms of violence and power. Lucrezia in Ferrara was not just a competent administrator and patron of the arts. She was a person, navigating the complexities of a real life with real feelings in a world that had never given her much room for either. On August 18, 1503, exactly 3 years to the day after Alfonso of Aragon was strangled in his hospital room, Pope Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old. The cause was most likely a fever, possibly malaria, though contemporary rumor immediately suggested poison. Rome being Rome, it always suggested poison. Here is where the story of the Borgias ends, not with a dramatic battle or a public execution, but with something almost mundane, a sick old man dying in the summer heat. Cesare was simultaneously gravely ill. The same fever had struck them both at the same time. For weeks he hovered at death's door, while the political world he had spent years constructing fell apart around him. He survived the illness, but the empire did not survive the Pope. Without Alexander VI holding the papacy, without the Vatican's resources and authority behind him, Cesare's carefully built network of alliances and terror dissolved with astonishing speed. Cities he had conquered reversed allegiance. Former enemies came out of hiding. The ruthless efficiency that had made him the terror of the peninsula suddenly had no institutional foundation to stand on. He was captured. He escaped. He fled to Navarre in Spain, where his brother-in-law was king, and on March 12, 1507, Cesare Borgia, the man who inspired the prince, who had strangled rivals and sacked cities and remade the map of central Italy, was killed in a minor skirmish outside the small town of VIII. He was 31 years old. He had ridden out ahead of his escort and was surrounded by enemy soldiers who ran him through with lances. Nobody important came to find the body for hours. The architect of Renaissance terror died alone in a ditch at 31, in a minor engagement that barely registered as news. The golden boy was already gone. The patriarch was in the ground, and now the warlord was finished too. Lucrezia outlived all of them. The daughter they used as a political instrument, handed from marriage to marriage while her reputation was burned to ash by enemies and circumstances she could not control. She was still in Ferrara, running a duchy, patronizing the arts, raising children, corresponding with poets, still alive, still building. The woman the Borgias used to survive outlasted every single one of them. So here is the thesis. Here is the thing this whole story has been building toward. The legend of Lucrezia Borgia is one of the most comprehensive and successful character assassinations in the historical record. And it was built on three foundations: the crimes of her family, the propaganda of her enemies, and a structural misogyny so embedded in Renaissance Europe and in the 5 centuries of storytelling that followed, that it has been almost impossible to dislodge. The incest accusations came from a man whose pride was wounded. There is no corroborating evidence. The poison mythology traces almost entirely to hostile sources with clear motives to slander the family. The mystery of the infans Romanus has never been resolved. But what is clear is that the official record was deliberately falsified by the one man with the power to do it, and Lucrezia was never named. The murdered husband's narrative collapses under examination. One was very much alive and simply embarrassing, and one was murdered by her brother in a political calculation that Lucrezia demonstrably tried to prevent by cooking the man's food herself. None of this means the Borgias were misunderstood innocents. They were not. Rodrigo bought the papacy. Cesare murdered his way across Italy with the tactical precision of a medieval warlord. Juan was probably killed by his own brother. The family operated with a casual contempt for the rules everyone else was expected to follow, and they left considerable destruction in their wake. But Lucrezia was the daughter. She was handed to Giovanni Sforza at 13. She was taken back when convenient and publicly humiliated in the process. She vanished into a convent during one of the most mysterious episodes of her family's history and emerged with her reputation worse than when she entered. She watched her second husband be murdered in his hospital bed after she had fought to save him. She had no army. She issued no independent orders. She held no political authority until Ferrara gave her one, and in Ferrara, she used it well. Why did the myth stick? Several reasons worth naming plainly. Powerful families attract powerful enemies, and powerful enemies write history. The Borgias made enemies at every level of Italian and European politics. When the family's influence collapsed after Alexander VI's death, those enemies were free to say whatever they wanted about people who were no longer in a position to retaliate. Renaissance gossip traveled fast and stuck hard. Scandalous stories about the Pope's illegitimate daughter were irresistible content. They were repeated, embellished, and eventually codified into histories that later centuries accepted as fact. And then there is misogyny. Say it plainly because it is the most important factor of all. Lucrezia Borgia was a woman adjacent to power in an era that did not permit women to hold power cleanly. She could not be the political strategist. That had to be her father. She could not be the ruthless operator. That was Cesare. So history cast her as something else: the seductress, the poisoner, the femme fatale, the feminine embodiment of Borgia corruption. It required no evidence because the role was already written before she was born. History looked at the Borgia crimes and needed a female face to attach them to. Lucrezia's was the closest one available. Alfonso d'Este became Duke of Ferrara in 1505 when his father died. Lucrezia became Duchess. She continued as she had begun, administering, patronizing the arts, raising children, managing the complex politics of a Renaissance court. She was productive. She was respected. She was, by any reasonable measure, good at it. But there is one final, brutal irony to her time in Ferrara that almost never makes it into the pop culture spin-offs. In her later years, the supposed demon seductress of Rome became profoundly, intensely devout. We are talking a literal hair shirt worn under her expensive gowns. She developed close relationships with Franciscan friars, corresponded deeply with religious figures, and spent significant time in extreme fasting and prayer. It turns out the woman history painted as a walking poison cabinet spent the twilight of her life practically living like a nun. But a pious, grieving woman seeking spiritual peace doesn't sell tickets, does it? It doesn't fit the monster Rome invented, so history just conveniently erased it. She was pregnant 10 times during the Ferrara years. Several children survived, several did not. The final pregnancy in 1519 went horribly wrong. She gave birth to a daughter who did not survive. Lucrezia herself never fully recovered from the complications. She died on June 24th, 1519. She was 39 years old. No dramatic downfall, no public ruin, no final spectacular act of villainy or revenge. She simply died in Ferrara of complications that killed women in childbirth with terrible regularity in that era. She had written a letter to Pope Leo X the day before, describing her weakening condition with a calm clarity that makes it one of the more moving documents from her life. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini. The court mourned. Alfonso reportedly locked himself away for several days. The Ferrarese, by all accounts, genuinely grieved. Rome, which had spent decades constructing a monster out of her, barely noticed. 500 years later, the poison myth is still the first thing most people know about Lucrezia Borgia. It turns up in operas, novels, films, television. The femme fatale in the Renaissance gown, the ring with the hidden compartment, the smile that means death. It is a great story. It has the shape of a great story, and it is built almost entirely on sand. The historical reality is this: Lucrezia Borgia was born into one of the most dangerous, corrupt, and powerful families in the history of European politics. She had no say in any of the arrangements made for her. She survived an annulment designed to humiliate her. She disappeared into a convent during one of the most mysterious episodes of the era and emerged with the rumors worse than before. She was trusted with the administration of the Vatican by the Pope himself, a fact that barely registers in the popular story. She survived being blamed for crimes her father and brother committed. She survived the murder of a husband she actually cared about, and she survived the total collapse of the Borgia Empire that followed her father's death. And then she outlived all of them. Juan in the Tiber, Alexander in the ground, Cesare dead in a ditch in Navarre at 31. She outlasted every single person who had used her, damaged her, or defined her. She built something in Ferrara that bore her own mark. A court, a legacy, a reputation earned rather than inherited. She conducted a literary correspondence with the finest minds of her age. She ran a duchy competently through some of its most difficult years. She was, in the end, something that the legend never allows her to be. A person. Complicated, capable, shaped by forces she could not control, but navigating them with more intelligence and resilience than the story has ever credited her for. The women who get remembered as monsters are usually the women who survived things that should have destroyed them. Lucrezia Borgia was remembered as a poisoner, a seductress, a scandal wrapped in silk. But when you strip away the rumors, the enemies, the bitter men with wounded pride, and the 5 centuries of storytelling that followed, what you're left with isn't a monster. It's a woman who survived one of the most dangerous families in history, outlived every single one of them, and somehow lived long enough to become something else entirely. That's the real story. And it is so much more interesting than the legend. But the legend was easier to sell, so that's the one that survived.